UFTV is your university and community TV station.
Mariah, I'm sorry. I just thought of a bad joke. I've been a pastor in my previous life, and I know of pastors who got up to speak and never had their sermon at the pulpit because somebody who was there before them graciously took everything with them as they cleared off the pulpit. So I won't do that. All right, tonight we are very privileged and honored to have a native of Hancock County to join us and to present at our third of 3 lectures in the Religious Studies lecture series. And so tonight we welcome Mariah Mercer, who serves as the East Asia Pacific Unit Chief of the U.S. Department of State's Office of International Religious Freedom. The IRF office has the mission of promoting religious freedom as a core objective of the U.S. foreign policy and monitors religious freedom abuses and discrimination worldwide, recommending and implementing policies in respective regions of the country or countries, and develops programs to promote religious freedom. Ms. Mercer joined the Office of International Religious Freedom in 2016. In 2018, she served as the Deputy Coordinator for the inaugural Ministry to Advance Religious Freedom, and has served in various other capacities in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. And prior to joining the State Department, she was a journalist here in Hancock County at the Findlay Publishing Company, where she served as a reporter for the Courier's Family Department and the features editor of the Review Times. She won 7 Associate Press Awards during her career, and she has also served as information officer for the UN Information Center in Australia. We are very honored to have you. And if you would at this point, Mariah, come and share your experience with us. Thank you. Would you welcome her? There you go.
Thank you. All right. Thank you guys for all coming out and braving COVID-19. Wash your hands, please. So as Dale's had kind of to share, my biography is a little all over the place, but right now I have the honor of representing the U.S. State Department and all of you in our advocacy for international religious freedom abroad. The U.S. State Department, for those of you who have worked with us before, how many of y'all have passports? Great, that is fantastic. You have worked with the State Department because we are the folks who made that for you and took your check. Thank you. And so what we do is we handle all of our foreign affairs duties through diplomacy, advocacy, assistance, and advancing our interests abroad. What my office does, among the many, many folks at the State Department, is advocate for rights for all. The right that our office focuses on is religious freedom. How many of y'all think your religious freedom, what's your level? Any high, good, middle, low? You guys are actually doing really great, because there is an assessment by the Pew Research folks about the level of religious freedom globally, and America ranks quite high. We do have some restrictions, but overall, we're doing pretty well. What we are looking at is all the countries outside of the U.S. The Department of Justice, FBI, those are the folks who take a look at religious freedom here. So I'm only going to talk about other countries. So religious freedom is the individual freedom to hold any faith or none at all. It covers theistic, deistic, atheistic beliefs, and it's the freedom to change your faith, and it's the freedom from being coerced to have one faith or another. It's also a bundled right. So your religious freedom is about more than where you get to go on Saturday or Sunday morning. It's about whether you are able to speak your mind. If you have a belief about how the world is, the universe should be, you should be able to speak that without hesitation, and without restriction. You should be able to associate with people from your religious community or other communities as however you like. You should be able to express yourself online or in person with reasonable freedom. You should be able to hold property. If you have a church or religious community, you want to have a meeting, you should be able to buy land and have services. So we're there to defend all of these things. And an important note is this, under customary international law, is something vested in you as an individual. Communities don't have rights, you have rights. So we take our standards from a couple of different documents. We have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was drafted by representatives from all around the world. It really is a global document, people from all backgrounds in 1948, and it's among the standards. So Article 18, everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and it's a right to change that. Article 19, you have the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and Article 20, everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. In the UDHR context, that's non-binding, don't worry about that. We're also going to look at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And Article 18 is really the gold standard for religious freedom nowadays. It's the right, similar to the UDHR, thought, conscience, religion, and you can have or adopt a religion or belief of your choice, and no one is subject to coercion. So those are the international standards. Not everyone's a signatory to ICCPR. Some folks have reservations, some folks haven't signed at all, but generally this is the international standard that everyone is meant to be held accountable to. In the US context, we have the US Constitution, First Amendment. We have, unique to our country, the Establishment Clause. And that prohibits the US government from doing anything that will respect the establishment of a religion. So that can mean if you are perceived to be favoring one group over another, believers over non-believers, Christians over Muslims, any of these things are not permitted under our Constitution, and our courts have upheld that very tightly. A lot of countries don't have this, and so it can sometimes put us in tension. We also have a free exercise clause, so you should be able to exercise that religion freely, and that is a lot of the opportunities where countries put restrictions on. You can have a religion, but you can't have it in this way. You can't proselytize. You can't share your faith on the corner if you so choose. It is not something they have often respected. So our office was created by Congress, which is great because they're the ones who also write my check and let us have all of our money to create the office, to hire people, to do the work that they want done. And they decided in 1998 to create a group at the State Department who would specifically advocate on this issue. So we are led by an ambassador at large for religious freedom. It currently is Sam Brownback, who was former senator and a former governor. Prior to that, we had our first rabbi, David Saperstein, who served under President Obama. And before that, we had a Baptist pastor. And before that, we had an academic. We've had all kinds of different folks from different stripes. And one of the major things we do is every single year we write a report on the religious freedom circumstances in every single country, and that gets submitted to Congress. It's also available for you in case you need some nice reading to put you to sleep or to make you sad about the world. Please check us out. We just released the Human Rights Report, and the Religious Freedom Report will take place in a couple months as soon as everything happens in the world. Never expect the US government to adhere to a deadline. It's not real. So these are matters of fact for the US government. If we put it in a report, that means we believe it happened, and so that can have implications for you. If you're doing a research project, if you know somebody who's trying to claim asylum and they say that they're from a country where their religion is illegal and they can't practice, and if they go back, they'll be arrested. If it's in the Religious Freedom Report, you can assume the US government believes it's true. So we also do designation of countries of particular concern. So that means a government has engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom. And they have to be egregious. They can't just be like small restrictions. This means someone's in jail. This means someone's being killed. This means that folks are experiencing a high level of violence. They also had an update to the act in 2016. It was passed by a Republican Congress and signed into law by President Obama. And it elevated this office even more. It caused my boss to report straight to the Secretary of State, so he can transmit information without any filters, which is great. Helps us provide a gut check on what's happening in the world. And it created a special watch list for countries that are not just engaging in these really severe and egregious abuses, but also where we're worried that things are going to happen, things are going to go badly. And it allowed us to identify entities of particular concern. So these can be folks like ISIS, terrorist groups who are controlling territory and restricting people's ability to engage in religious freedom. So great example is ISIS in Syria and Iraq. They enforced their particular version of Islam and burned down churches, stupas for Yazidi, which is another religion in that area, and forced marriage, forced some women into slavery, basically. So we have a few countries, particular concerns that have been on it for a real long time, unfortunately. We have Burma, or Myanmar. The US government put it on in 1999. China also went on in 1999. Iran, oh gosh, guys. Okay, Sudan, which is in the process of revisiting its religious freedom law, so hopefully next year. North Korea in 2001, Eritrea, Saudi Arabia, Turkmenistan, and Tajikistan. It is possible to improve and to get off this list. We removed Vietnam in 2006 when they entered into a binding agreement promising to take a number of steps, and so they got off the list, and we've given them some support, and they are broadly trending toward better. We also took Uzbekistan off the list and moved them onto the special watch list because they released a lot of prisoners. They took some very clear, concrete steps. So we have systemic challenges in the course of what we're up to. And the first is the government can favor religion over others. You see that in Saudi Arabia. You can only be Muslim in order to be a citizen. It's a requirement under their law. And all other religions are tolerated, but it's not legal. Often if you try to practice your faith, you'll find yourself in trouble. You also might have instances where there's an absence of rule of law. You see that in Nigeria. The government has very little control over what happens outside the capital, and so there are a lot of terrorist groups, herders who are attacking various folks for various reasons, and there's just impunity. You see in Pakistan, in Egypt. We also have authoritarian states who are seeking absolute control across the board, and religious freedom gets impacted as well. That's particularly true in China, North Korea, Uzbekistan, although it's loosening a little bit. So generally, there's controls on their expression across the board. You couldn't criticize the controlling leader or party. You also can't start your own church because that's an independent line of influence and control that they don't have any control, any ability to manipulate. We also see hatred and discrimination over long-standing identity differences in a country. One example is Myanmar. It's been a long time a Buddhist majority country, and there's a lot of tension over the Muslim community who lives in the periphery and the Christian in the north. Governments often advocate for harmony, which leads to suppression. So you being not like me is not supporting harmony, harmonious relations, and tolerance. And so they will stop you from exercising your religious beliefs. There's also a perception that too much religious freedom can lead to sectarian violence or encourage extremism. You see that a lot in Russia. They have taken some particularly draconian measures when it comes to Jehovah's Witnesses and some Muslim communities. There's a perception, general intolerance and lack of respect for diversity also is a problem. We have in our religious freedom report 2 different sections. One's on what the government's doing, and the other is what society does. So you have a responsibility as an informed citizen and student to respect and tolerate those who aren't like you. And we'll report on that in other countries. So unfortunately, things have not been going great lately. There have been increasing levels of religious freedom restriction over the past 30 years. If you take a look at that map, the darker it is, the worse it is. And if you take a look, this is from Pew, you can see the US State Department does not rank ourselves, but Pew does, and there are some restrictions in the US, as I mentioned. And part of that is when we make rules that govern the right to practice this could be perceived as a restriction. But you'll see really dark levels over in South and Central Asia, China, parts of Africa. And right now, more than 80% of the world lives under restriction on their religious freedom in some way, shape, or form. So it goes into what are we doing? So I made the mistake of animating this, and so it's going to take a while. So we have information. One of the number one things we're doing is we're talking to people all around the world, and we live in a really unique world. I think you are all mostly very young, so you might not remember a time when the internet didn't exist. But until the 90s or so, when email became a thing, you'd have to wait days, if not weeks, to get a formal thing they call a cable, to get information about what's happening in a country. You'd have newspaper articles, but there would be a huge delay. Now, I can hear from a man on top of a mountain in Iraq in one phone call. All he needs is a satellite dish and a car battery, and we're in business. So we're collecting information. What is really going on in a country? And then we're analyzing it. Not everything is as it appears, so we need to take our time and look at the incidents. What's driving it? Is this a situation in which they burned down a church, but really it's about a property dispute? Was this about the really wonderful land that had oil underneath it, and so that's the reason? Or was it solely because of anti-Christian hatred in a particular country? You do the same thing with Islam. Was the mosque burnt down in Rakhine State because the Buddhist nationalists hated Islam, or did they want to build a pipeline for China? You have to do that level of analysis and investigation. All right, resources. We have a lot of different opportunities to engage with the international community. Our office has a programming budget, so we look for NGOs around the world who have ideas about how to make religious freedom better, and then we fund them. If you go abroad and you were to work with an advocacy organization, if you were to work with other countries to train speakers on how to speak for themselves and go to their governments and ask for and advocate for their rights, that's the kind of thing the U.S. government spends a lot of money doing, including our office. We have a small chunk of that money. We also try to cultivate expertise. There have been a number of new scholars and folks studying this issue in the past 10 years. We've got folks who have taken a look at how economic prosperity is linked to religious freedom. Diversity is good for the sake of being diverse, but it's also good for business. You will get better ideas when there are more diverse folks in the room, and that includes religious freedom. So we have something we call 1.5 track diplomacy. Most of what the State Department does is talk to governments. I'm going to talk to your Minister of Justice about how courts are enforcing and making rules and laws. But there are also other people who influence these sorts of things. So we're talking to religious leaders who talk to their government. We're hearing from them and hoping that they will come on board and advocate for religious freedom in these spaces as well. And frankly, a lot of the times, some of the most powerful people are not the one with minister before his name. Sometimes it's the daughter of the minister. Sometimes it's the woman who's serving tea in the middle of the Parliament House. And these folks are people you want to talk to as well. NGO engagement. We have a lot of civil society. The U.S. State Department has been very strongly engaged in supporting civil society, the people who are on the ground trying to change their own countries. And we try and work with them to get the information from the first bit of our diplomacy, and then also push out to them tools, skills, opportunities, links. Someone may be working on something in Indonesia that is really similar to something in Malaysia, and if I can help them talk to each other, then they could only do better. Diplomatic action. That is when we are coming to your ministry. I have a number of senior officials from various folks who will call up the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, whomever it is in a country, and make a very explicit ask. We think you should change your law. It's not in compliance with the ICCPR. It is causing this negative impact, and you should change it. And so that's more direct and usually happens after a long series of engagements and building and talking to folks throughout a country. So we really understand what we're talking to, who we're talking to, and what we're talking about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular case study right now that my office is very closely following, the Shin crisis. How many of y'all know what Shin is? Great, that's about right. 0 hands, thank you. 1/2 hand, I'm gonna give you partial credit. So China is one of our countries of particular concern, and it is an authoritarian regime. It's been led by the Chinese Communist Party for decades. But we began to see a number of changes and tightenings in the country when Xi Jinping came into power. Has been an overall tightening and restriction on the freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, association, expression, but in particular in Xinjiang, we're seeing a really dire crisis. There are up to 1 million people who've been put into camps. They called re-education camps the first time. But then as we go, we saw barbed wire on the outside of these camps. We saw watchtowers around these camps. We saw dorms being raised. No one got to go. And it became clear to anyone who was watching, these were not re-education camps. They were attempts to control a minority community in Western China called the Uyghurs. They are majority Muslim, and they have a deep, rich history in the area. They had some attempts to be separate from China historically, and then there was a fairly large incident in the province that caused them to this crackdown, where they just sort of China started systematically rounding up Uyghurs, bringing the camps to be indoctrinated. They had to shave beards. They were forced to eat pork. If you observe Ramadan, that was a sign of extremism. If you went to mosque, that was a sign of extremism. And they began to root out these communities. They have endured physical and psychological abuse. There have been eyewitness testimony from these places as they one by one get across the border into Kazakhstan or even into the US. Some folks have had citizenship or US visas make it back over here. But unfortunately, China has maintained a really tight control on the information about this area. We have had to spend the last year and a half or so arguing the facts, which is less fun than trying to change what's going on. So independent media, scholarly research have shown that things like the Hotan province bought 2,768 police batons, 550 cattle prods, 1,300 handcuffs, 2,800 cans of pepper spray. And the level of detention has hit almost every family in Xinjiang. They're arresting doctors, they're arresting academics. These are people who don't need re-educated. They are just average, everyday citizens. And now they've started moving them from the camps, once they've been indoctrinated sufficiently, into factories. So there's now forced labor involved in the creation of a number of products that make their way into the US. So, and then in addition to that, when you do leave the camp, even if you don't get into a factory, the party has implemented very draconian surveillance systems throughout the province. Every single thing you do is watched. If you are familiar with 1984 from your high school lessons, this would be very similar. You can't go to a mosque without being filmed. You can't go to a mall without being filmed. Your face, with the facial recognition, you get a social credit score based on your behaviors. If you are involved in anything that the party has decided is undesirable, your social credit score goes down, and so does everyone around you. So there's a lot of pressure for you to conform and do as they want. So that's some satellite imagery that has analyzed what we can see from Digital Globe, our imagery source, for the camps. You see guards, you see towers, you see borders. You do not see the ability to go in and out. You see huge dorms, and there's clearly more going on than the CCP would like you to believe. Okay, so what can you do about this? The first step is learning what's going on in the world. Like I said, China is the area where I'm spending a lot of my time right now, given the severity of the issue. But there are all kinds of issues all around the world. If you are particularly interested in any region, there's something you can advocate for. So first step is learn more and share with others. I would encourage you to take 1 or 2 of our Religious Freedom reports and read them. Just see what it looks like. And then take up a cause. If you're passionate about one particular faith, that's great. If you're passionate about one particular issue set, if you want to advocate for women's rights within the context of religious freedom, there's opportunities. And one of the things you can do is participate in an advocacy campaign. There are a number of folks who have already been active in this space, available online, and have plenty of ideas for you. There's an organization called the 21st Wilberforce Initiative that looks at international religious freedom around the world. Amnesty International picks up political prisoner campaigns and encourages folks to write their congressmen, write write the State Department, write these other governments, and ask for their release. Discuss with your representatives. You guys are in a wonderful state with many folks who have high levels of interest in this. Invite them to come and then talk to them about religious freedom. Talk about how important this is to you and what you'd like to see them do. And then consider whether anything that you're doing, any behaviors that you're engaged in, are supporting this. Because I'm looking at China, I'm seeing things that I own. I have 2 iPhones, and those companies have been implicated in forced labor practices within China. So I need to take a real hard look at myself and make sure that when I'm making these choices, my money is going to companies that are not complicit in these abuses. All right, so this is the best part of the whole presentation where you guys get to talk at me, ask questions. I will pick on you if you do not come up with some real fun stuff. So I expect to see some hands in the air very, very soon. Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a list of those companies somewhere?
I do. So there's an organization called the Australia Strategic Policy Initiative, ASPI, and they just authored a report called Shin for Uyghurs for Sale, and I'm happy to send that to Dale for you all. It gives a list of 80 companies whose supply chains have been implicated in forced labor practices in China. And it is probably something you own. It's something I own. A couple of folks I did not recognize. And part of this is just it's real hard to get information out. These may not be countries, these companies may not necessarily have been aware that they were implicated in it, but these folks have had a number of months to go through and really look at the supply chains in China and come up with some areas of concern. There are also some things the U.S. government has done to try and protect you from having this be a problem. We have export and import controls that the U.S. government oversees. So we work with the Department of Commerce and Treasury to identify particular products, areas, or entities within China that are very clearly meet the evidentiary burden of having forced labor in its practices, and we won't allow it to be imported. It's real hard. You still have to keep an eye on it and just do everything you can to be ethical and informed in your consumption. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Over the years, have you seen any change in terms of the State Department's perspectives on religious freedom with the change of administrations in the U.S.?
So we're actually very bipartisan in nature, which is great because you want to have something you can build that everyone's a part of and everyone believes in and survives over time. At the present moment, the administration, this is one of their highest priorities, is advocating for religious freedom. We, in my super lengthy bio, discussed my role in our ministerial to advance religious freedom. It was the first of its kind, and it called together more than 90 countries to identify ways they can protect this right more robustly, and that was the first of its kind. And Ambassador Brownback was at the forefront of that. It's been a passion for him for 20 years, so I will say there has been a really keen interest in doing that right now. Fortunately, I think this is something all folks agree on. You can debate a lot of things, but whether or not you should have this freedom isn't one of them. This is established throughout the Congress, throughout our various executive agencies, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to work with them. I'm okay, I'm going to throw a question to you because I had 45 minutes and I talked fast. So how many of you have traveled abroad? Okay. How many of you traveled to a country that was on my CPC list? China, Burma? Okay. How many of you observed any of the things I'm talking about when you were traveling abroad? None. Great. So that's part of the issue is Americans often don't see a lot of what's happening here. It's usually a little more subtle, a little more hidden, and it's harder for us to appreciate because we have such freedom here, what it is like in other contexts. So next time you are traveling, I would encourage you to maybe check out one of the religious sites at the countries you're going to. Visit a church, visit a mosque, visit a temple. One, they're gorgeous and fantastic, and two, you can sort of see how people are practicing. You see how many people are going there. You can engage with communities who you may not otherwise see at the tourist sites. Sir?
Is Islam in China in general being persecuted, or in the one section?
So all faiths in China are experiencing persecution, period. You are not permitted to have a Bible as you would understand it. These are all translated to be in accordance with the CCP. Tibetan Buddhists are not allowed to practice their faith as they see fit. They are not allowed to revere the Dalai Lama. They are not allowed to observe some of their holy days. And Islam is also carefully controlled. It is particularly controlled in Xinjiang in part because of their separatist history, and it's very remote, and it's been outside of the control of the CCP. But across the country, the religious regs do not allow for free observance of Ramadan, mosques to be conducted as you see fit, you to give the Friday prayers as you like. And our ambassador has said that China is at war with faith. And I think there's a lot of support for that, unfortunately. I saw another hand in back if you're willing to indulge me.
Yes, so I haven't been to the countries on the list, but Cuba I have been to, and I think you said at the beginning the religious faith of the individual versus the organization more. So
Yeah.
in Cuba, the Christians have to be in small groups to meet. Is that
Yeah.
something that is being considered in countries in general?
So that's not an uncommon restriction, and we would not consider that in being in full compliance. So you see that actually in Vietnam is another place that happens. The churches can only get so big, and then you cannot meet any longer. And a part of this is, I think it's related to the authoritarian inclinations. They want to have control over civil society, and if you start building a large church, that's a risk for you guys to get together and have some unwelcome thoughts for the government in question. So I think it's written up, and if we're about to issue our new report, I think they'll be talking about some of those things. There was also some practices in Cuba that where folks are, I would argue, practicing their faith. Social justice and advocacy can be a component of your faith. So we're not interpreting this really narrowly. This isn't about necessarily only where you go to church, where you go to mosque, having that ability. If you consider part of your faith advocating for the poor or on behalf of the oppressed, the imprisoned, then that's a religious freedom as well. And I think Cuba's one of those instances in which the Catholic Church has been facing a lot of difficulty in that regard. Yes, sir.
So is the State Department still doing a lot of their on-ground research and things in countries like China right now?
Mostly, yes. Right now, we are on ordered departure for our folks in Beijing. We have either the largest or one of the largest foreign ministries in the world. We just have a huge number of folks deployed. I think China's probably, if they haven't surpassed us, will be closest. So we have, and all of our embassies around the world are open right now, other than Beijing, which has had most of the staff come back to the U.S. given the COVID-19 concerns, and then there's some authorized departures elsewhere in China, if you who are facing respiratory issues or immunocompromised. But our folks are out there every single day. So my office is right now in the vicinity of 35 people, and we're doing this from the U.S. and we're coordinating, but we have the opportunity to work with our colleagues abroad who are there every single day, advocating, meeting with people, talking to the governments, trying to figure out ways to incentivize them to do better on this right or build partnerships. And none of that will stop. Even if we all go on to self-quarantine, this is why we have Skype and the internet and the phone calls, and they'll keep doing it. It's part of our mandate. Sir?
In a recent trip that President Trump made to India, there was word, or the media talked about skirmishes regarding Islam and the Hindus. Can you address that in any way?
Sure. So I don't cover India. I will say that the U.S. government has been very clear that we expect the violence to cease, the government to take measures to protect all communities, and we've expressed a lot of concern about the underlying citizenship law that prompted some of these some of this violence. And again, I don't cover India, but if I recall, he did raise it in the meeting with President Modi, or Prime Minister Modi. Sorry, don't cover India. And we continue to engage in that. I actually was able to go to India for other reasons earlier in the year. We've had some quiet diplomacy. We've talked about this, but it is very deeply concerning. Yes, sir.
We are also helping American people in trouble in your country by doing religious work. For example, in China, there are some Korean American pastors working for helping local Korean activities. So sometimes we're stuck in China, sometimes we're arrested by Chinese government. Are you in charge of helping with this?
So we do some work with that. The U.S. government has part of our State Department colleagues under the consular section. And if you're an American citizen or legal permanent resident, there's a section called American Citizen Services. If you're ever in trouble, please, please, please call us. Our number one responsibility is to American citizens, making sure that you are safe and protected abroad. And so they do very specific advocacy work, but we do raise sometimes with the right officials if they've had some sort of a right that has been violated. The thing to sort of be aware of when you're traveling, though, is you are subject to that country's laws, regardless of whether or not we think the laws are fair or in compliance with their national obligations. And so sometimes there's less we can do. We will advocate for the general right. We think governments should be receptive to proselytization. We think that they should allow it. You should be allowed to talk about your faith and however you choose when you're abroad. But if countries made it illegal, it's really, really hard for us to unpack that real fast if you get into trouble. So contact American Citizen Services. They will work with you, and they are the kind of folks who handle all kinds of crisis. Any ridiculous thing any American's done abroad, these folks can help, including me. I've done several ridiculous things abroad, which is, sir?
Did your department make any response to President Trump's ban on Muslims?
So that's handled by the Department of Homeland Security, and they have the responsibility there in terms of implementing the guidance for visa eligibility. I think that among the things they had to say is that those were country-based and they weren't religious-based, and it's somewhere in the courts right now, but it's sort of outside of my purview.
Country-based rather than although you call it said Muslims.
I think that's my understanding, but again, that's outside my purview, so I don't want to speak out of turn. Yes, ma'am? Sorry, to clarify, decisions, the State Department has a role in visa eligibility. So when you apply to go to another country, if you don't have an agreement with that country that you can travel without a visa permission to enter, you have to get a visa. So the State Department issues those. But the ultimate authority about who is allowed to come to the U.S. resides with the Department of Homeland Security. So we can issue a visa, but that level, following the guidance of the President and the Congress, the Immigration Nationalization Something Act, INSA, that is the folks who sort of make the rules about visas. But at the end of the day, DHS has the responsibility for actual entry into the U.S. Yes, ma'am? Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So where this is going to be unfair, because I think I don't have my colleague to come. I work at the Department of State, and what we do is we look externally, and so that would be something I can advocate for. In that case, the folks who would have the responsibility is the Department of Justice. And yes, when you are in this country, you have a series of protections that are anyone who's in the U.S. could come to, and they have an Office of Civil Rights that is involved in advocating for protections you could report to, as well as a number of state, local, and federal authorities additionally. And if anyone experiences that sort of thing, I frankly hear about it a lot, and it moves my heartstrings, but I have to refer it to the folks who actually have the mandate, and that's the Department of Justice. Cool. All right, last call. All right, great. Well, you guys have been wonderful, and I really appreciate your questions. I'm happy to chat a little bit more after, and if you have any question with the State Department writ large, I really encourage you to apply to our internship program to take a look at the opportunities we have to study abroad, international visitor programs, hosting someone here. We have a lot of engagement that I think would be beneficial to your community and to the University of Findlay, and I hope you will follow up with me and chat afterward. Thank you.